but also how do we fund passenger rail systems? What are their places within our existing infrastructure, within our existing communities? But also, how do we take advantage of the remarkable opportunities that are created through this type of investment, as well as keeping up the investments that have already been made? And so with us today is Edward Durford, who's our Director of Community Action for Strong Towns, but also Mike Christensen, who is a member of CNU and I don't even know all of the different ways to describe you. He's a longtime Strong Towns member and a consultant on a lot of different passenger rail projects residing in the Salt Lake City area. And so, Mike, welcome to Ask Strong Towns Anything. And you wanted to share a few things just to kick things off. So why don't you start with that?
Well, let me just give you a brief overview of how I got involved in Strong Towns and also CNU because both happened at the same time. But I was a grad student at the University of Utah working on a Master of City and Metropolitan Planning back in 2013 and happened to be enrolled in a class called Intro to New Urbanism. And at the same time, it just so happened that CNU was being hosted in Salt Lake City. And prior to CNU, the official CNU schedule starting up, there was actually an offsite presentation that was sponsored by our metropolitan planning organization here in Salt Lake City. And there were two keynote speakers. One was an up and coming author named Jeff Speck, who had just written Walkable City. And the other was an up and coming rabble rouser from Brainerd, Minnesota, named Chuck Marone. And so I have been very involved in CNU and Strong Towns ever since then. So it was kind of baptism by fire into urbanism. And I also, along the way, got involved in passenger rail advocacy and learning how we can actually increase the opportunities and efficiencies of our communities through passenger rail investments. And this is specifically intercity passenger rail, which is not typically it's trips over 100 miles. And after graduating from the University of Utah, I actually started a nonprofit called the Utah Rail Passengers Association because I realized that there was a need in Utah to be advocating for things. And the proposal that I really focused on studying as a grad student was looking at what we could do in Utah with the rail infrastructure that already exists. And on the map there, the gold highlighted portion is where our commuter rail system runs, where we have service at least hourly and half hourly during peak times. And the thin blue line going across the state of Utah from east to west is the route of the California Zephyr that goes from Chicago to the Bay Area, which is the only Amtrak service that we have in Utah. So the thing that I spent my time studying was how we could use the existing infrastructure to create the red lines, which are hopefully future rail services that we'll have in Utah that will connect up the rest of the state to our metropolitan region here in Salt Lake City. And also have to apologize to the Canadians in the room because this is going to be a little bit centric towards the US, but the way that the rail system operates in Canada is very similar to the way that it does in the US. Uh, but by no means are these trains going to be super fast. They would typically operate up to 79 miles per hour, although there are provisions to increase the speed up to 125 miles per hour if the right investments are made in the tracks. And this is a system that we're looking to have at least 3 round trips a day so that people would have a morning, a midday, and an evening train to choose from. Uh, and one of our big issues here in Utah is down in the southwest corner of Utah, one of our fastest growing, or the fastest growing community in Utah, and one of the fastest growing communities in the nation, which is St. George, which is located in Washington County. It has no rail connection whatsoever. And so we are also looking at ways to try to solve that. But towards the more national issues, I have been involved heavily in the National Rail Passengers Association. I've been involved in leadership ever since 2014 and actually joined its board of directors in 2019. And the Rail Passengers Association was created back in 1967 when we were really having a crisis of trying to figure out what to do with passenger rail in the US. And out of the advocacy efforts of the Rail Passengers Association, Amtrak was formed, which a good question is why Amtrak? And the the National Rail Passenger Corporation, known as Amtrak, was created in 1970 by the Passenger Rail Service Act in order to relieve struggling freight railroads from the obligation to operate passenger service. So, in return from relief from the burden of passenger service, the participating railroads were required to give Amtrak rights of access to their networks and agreed to an avoidable cost formula for track use charges, which basically, in short, the railroads are required to give uh, access to operate passenger, to have Amtrak operate passenger trains, and they basically just get reimbursed for the cost of doing that. And the reason behind that is because back in the days, 150 plus years ago, when we really wanted to have railroads built across the country, the federal government gave lots of incentives to the railroads in order to build those services out. But there were strings attached, and one of those strings was operating passenger service. And that worked well until starting in the 1930s, although we didn't really see big issues until the 1950s. And the problem was that the federal transportation funding priorities changed, and it went from putting a lot of money towards rail infrastructure to switching that first to basically putting in lots of subsidies to make driving as cheap as possible, and then also adding subsidies to make flying as cheap as possible. And so the railroads were required to continue to operate passenger service, but they couldn't compete with the subsidies that driving and flying were getting. And so that was causing freight railroads to actually go out of business. And so they basically came to Congress in the late 1960s and were begging for a solution. And the solution was to take that requirement, that obligation to operate passenger service, and spin it off into a kind of sometimes confusing corporation that is technically a private corporation, but it has one shareholder, which is the federal government. Uh, and Amtrak has 3 categories of service across the network. One is the Northeast Corridor, which stretches from Boston all the way to Washington, D.C., and serves places like New York City and Philadelphia and Baltimore and a lot of other communities along the way. And it is the one major piece of rail infrastructure where Amtrak actually owns the tracks And it is the one major piece of rail infrastructure that's electrified, and it has multiple trains per hour operating on it. The other Another big category of service is long distance routes, which by statute are Amtrak routes that are longer than 750 miles in length. And with the exception of one train, all of the long distance routes are overnight trains, which have amenities like sleeping cars and dining cars, uh, and are often delayed by freight railroads. So I always warn people when they are taking trips to basically expect the train to be late, uh, which it often is, although sometimes it is perfectly on time too. And the other category is state-sponsored routes, which is the category where Amtrak is seeing the most growth in ridership and also new services. And these are routes that are less than 750 miles in length, which by statute, the states in which those services operate are required to provide the subsidy for those services. And we'll get more into that in a moment. But the way that this maps out on the screen, you see the gold highlighted portion in the Northeast is the Northeast corridor. The red lines are the state-sponsored services, and the blue lines are the long-distance services. And you do see overlap in a lot of corridors where the corridors are served by multiple types of trains, and it's kind of our overall hope to have more corridors, more sections of tracks served by multiple types of services, uh, because it does allow for a whole lot of more options for people to travel. And getting back to the work of the Rail Passengers Association, one of the really important things that we have done recently is to develop a socioeconomic benefit model, because there is a whole lot of focus. Anything passenger rail or transit related usually draws a whole lot of focus for how much is that subsidizing that service actually costing taxpayers. But there's usually not much attention paid to what the benefits are that communities actually get. So the Rail Passengers Association was able to partner with professors at the Trent Lott National Center at the University of Southern Mississippi to develop a socioeconomic benefit model that takes in-plan uh, economic modeling data and is basically able to examine an existing route or a potential route and quantify how much economic benefit is actually being provided to the communities that are served by a route. And we typically see routes producing at least three times the subsidy. But on some of the more higher demand corridors, we actually have seen that calculated at as much as nine times the subsidy. So for the people that are very fiscally conservative and concerned about how our taxes are being spent, this is actually a much better return on investment than definitely than highways are. And in fact, a lot of the benefits that are derived by operating passenger rail are things like reduced wear and tear on highways and reducing all of the pollution effects that you get from driving, and also reducing the costs involved with crashes that come from driving. So that gives you an overview of the benefits. One of the studies that I had the privilege of participating in was the Federal Railroad Administration's Amtrak daily long distance service study, which the map that is on the screen shows the existing Amtrak network. And unfortunately, there are a lot of gaps around the country. So the plan was basically examine the existing 15 long distance routes and look at how to supplement that over the next 15 years or so in order to fill in the gaps and basically update our our long distance system to meet our current needs. And the results of the study uh, produced this map, which takes our existing 15 long distance routes and adds an additional 15 routes and fills in a whole lot of gaps around the nation. And I get, a lot of questions about what it's going to actually take to get a system like this implemented. And it actually is going to take a whole lot of advocacy work. So if you look at this map, and especially if you're if you live in one of the communities that lacks Amtrak service, and you would be getting Amtrak service from this vision, we are really looking for your help to help advocate for implementing this, because this really depends on people being vocal about wanting to have service expanded across the country. And we really need to be pushing Congress to keep this map at the forefront. And in terms of uh, things that can be done at the state level, I'd really like to point to North Carolina as an example. In addition to 3 long distance routes that cross North Carolina, uh, well, actually 4 long distance routes that cross North Carolina. The state of North Carolina also subsidizes service that runs from New York City all the way to Charlotte with 1 round trip a day. And then they have multiple round trips a day that run on that same corridor between Charlotte and Raleigh. And they have seen a massive increase in ridership. But North Carolina has shown that they are definitely not done. They are in the process of working on a dozen proposals for new passenger rail service through the Federal Railroad Administration's Corridor Identification and Development Program. And they have gotten funding awarded to study 7 of those corridors, which they're currently in the process of developing. And they have an additional 5 corridors that they want to apply for funding for in the future. So I really look at North Carolina as an example of how to really have a vision of what services your state wants to develop. And I wish that Utah was picking up that same type of effort. Uh, when I showed this map before, uh, it is actually slightly out of date because in the last year and a half, 2 new Amtrak services have been added, which really provide good case studies for how new services are providing new opportunities. One new service that was launched in May of 2024, so a little over a year ago, is the Borealis, which runs between Chicago and St. Paul and does 1 round trip a day. It is, well, yeah, service started in May 2024, 411 miles in length with 11 intermediate stations. It is 7.5 hours by train, but just under 6 hours by car if there's not any traffic. Uh, But despite being an hour and a half longer than driving, ridership over its first year was almost double the initial projections. And there were a lot of times throughout the year when the train was booked out completely. And they're actually working on what needs to be done to add a second round trip. And it's a 2 hour trip by plane, and there are actually 21 to 35 flights per day going between either Minneapolis St. Paul Airport or O'Hare and Minneapolis St. Paul and Chicago Midway. So there is a lot of flight traffic that could be done by train if the service were increased. Uh, it's also interesting to note that this corridor is also served by the Empire Builder, which is the long distance route that runs from Chicago to Portland and Seattle. One of the big questions was whether adding additional service would actually reduce travel demand on the Empire Builder between the Twin Cities and Chicago. And the Borealis has not cannibalized ridership on the Empire Builder. In fact, it is showing that the more service that you provide on a corridor, the more ridership you get because you're offering people more flexibility in their travel. And so we tend to say things like, well, if you double the ridership, you often end up tripling, or excuse me, if you double the service, you often end up tripling the ridership because you're allowing for more flexibility. And the other new service that was added just a couple months ago is the Mardi Gras service that runs between New Orleans and Mobile. And it launched in August, and it is 145 miles in length with four intermediate stations. It is 4.5 hours by train, but it's only 2 hours by car, so it's even uh, much slower by train. But despite that, ridership is exceeding all of the initial projections, and we're getting lots of sold out trains there. And it actually runs two round trips a day on that route. And there are no direct flights between Mobile uh, and New Orleans. And there was service on this route, but it was discontinued because of damage by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. And it's a really long, complicated story, but it has taken almost 20 years to get that service restarted on that section. But both of these examples really point to the fact that there is massive latent demand for intercity passenger rail in the US. And one of the questions that I got from a colleague, and this is probably about a decade ago, where we were at a conference of the Utah chapter of the American Planning Association, and we had a lot of people talking about incremental approaches like tactical urbanism. So I went on the Strong Towns website and stole this photo just to have a picture of a tactical urbanism treatment, which is, I'm sure being a Strong Towns crowd, everybody knows what tactical urbanism is, but it's like, what is the next smallest step that you can take in your community by, in this example, making an intersection safer by putting paint on the ground and flex posts and planters, and is something that is relatively inexpensive. And if it doesn't work out, it's also relatively inexpensive to change it. And so, in the light of like all of this conversation on tactical urbanism, but also talking to colleagues about the vision that I have for expanding passenger rail in Utah, one of my colleagues said, well, is there a tactical urbanism strategy for implementing passenger rail? Are there smaller steps that we can take? And unfortunately, due to the nature of things, it doesn't really work well as a smaller step. And part of that is that to do a like a trial program, like, oh, hey, let's try out passenger rail for 1 year. The problem is that the capital costs are essentially the same to do a trial as to actually implement the service, into the future. So there are a lot of difficulties in actually doing that. Part of it is the private ownership of rail infrastructure that exists in both US and Canada makes it really difficult and time consuming to start new services. And then there is a big problem in the US with the scarcity of rolling stock, which the rolling stock's the actual trains. So right now, if I had the money to go to a manufacturer to build a new train, it would take at least 5 years to get that equipment delivered. So we don't have a very big manufacturing capacity in the US for building new trains, which is something that we're trying to work on changing. Uh, and because of that, it is easier to start a new airline in the US than it is to add or restore an intercity passenger rail route, which is something that we are trying to work on strategies to actually change that here in the US to try to speed the delivery of new services to hopefully get it from, well, like in the case of the Mardi Gras, it was something that took 20 years. We really need to get it down to hopefully like a 2 year process. Uh, but part of that is just a lot of it. We really want to be able to deliver new services within a political cycle so that it becomes something that politicians actually want to do because they can actually get it done during their term. So I talked a whole lot, but I will go ahead and take questions. I've also got my email address up there. So
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. That's great. I love the context setting that we've got here. And just as a way to sort of bring us all in, let's I want you to go in the chat and drop in the chat whereabouts in the world that you currently are. And what we'll do then is it'll start to populate on the map, and we'll be able to see an overlay of where the train routes are versus where the people are. And then Mike will know exactly where to draw new lines. So Carlsbad, Berkshire County, awesome. Bound Brook, Des Moines. We've got Canada represented by Nathan, Fayetteville, Merced, Hilton Head, Walla Walla, Chandler. Trying to keep up. Ulster County, awesome. San Antonio. Let's see. Bloomington. Edward, did we get you in? You're out. Broken Arrow. Good stuff. Newton, Boston area. Perfect. And yeah. All right. We've got a thumbs up in Austin. All right. So super cool stuff. And if we think about that, and we compare it with our sort of the picture that you had here, I'm fascinated by the where we have the lines versus where they need to be. So this is where they need to be, all along the coast to support Strong Towns members, as well as that core connection right there. You can see a little bit of that actually already present. And so maybe we are working about with services that actually have the capacity for this. So this is more for the YouTube audience, just because I dropped in the chat a link to Mike's interview that he did on the Bottom Up Revolution this spring, this winter, this past winter. We also have a longer session on specifically high-speed rail called Build the Damn Train. And I thought it was fantastic. It was an excellent interview that Chuck did with Eric Goldwyn. And then the third one I wanted to highlight is Edward's just reflections on envisioning a rail culture for the US, and actually having to say we don't have to go far to identify what that would be, because we have it already in the prior history of the United States as well as North America, the broader landscape that's there. I want to pick up Brian's question here. Do you think, Mike, and then others, if you want to weigh in as well, I'd be happy to see that. In the North American context, is it more effective to focus on incremental improvements to passenger rail corridors things like increased frequencies, strategic investment at choke points. I think there's some legislative action that could be taken to like give priority to passenger rail again, like some of those biggies, but also maybe smaller increments, as opposed to very high speed rail projects. I love that Brian, ahead of your mention of the Borealis, mentioned that as examples of the incremental approach. Do you want to share some reflections on that, Mike?
Yeah, well, I have to go to a comment by Carrie where she said that she would rather drive, well, I'm not sure if you're he or she, sorry, but they said they would rather be on a train for 7.5 hour drive or for 7.5 hour ride than drive for 6 hours. I get a lot of people that tell me that uh, conventional passenger rail just won't work because like we need to make it faster than driving, or we need to have trains that are fast enough to compete with air travel.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of like obsession with high speed rail that um, I think people don't understand the what people are really looking for. Like I, for one, would rather take a longer train ride than be stuck behind the wheel of a car and be limited in what I can actually get done in that
Yeah.
period of time. So uh, so I think totally that we should be investing a whole lot more in making incremental improvements to the existing rail services. And that's not to say that we shouldn't also be involved investing in high-speed rail, but the problem is that building a new corridor, like we see that with high-speed rail construction in California, is it ends up taking multiple decades to get new services started.
Mhm.
Uh, I tell people that it usually, like right now, if you want high speed rail, it's going to be about a 30-year process at least, because it's going to take 10 years to plan it, 10 years to get organized, and then 10 years at least to actually build it. Whereas when you go back to the map of the planned hopeful future that we have for long distance routes, all of those routes are existing rail corridors. So the tracks are already there. It's just a matter of making relatively small improvements to the tracks. And the even bigger thing is that we need to not only replace our existing long distance fleet, which is about as old as I am. But we also have to build a whole new fleet for the new services. So, yeah, I think that that really is where you can apply the incremental strong towns approach to passenger rail, is making smaller improvements to existing services and also rolling out new or restoring prior services on existing corridors.
Hmm. Do you want to touch on, I mean, as we think about connecting cities, the default is always by highway. You've already demonstrated that highways don't have to be that tool. But the Bright Line in Florida is a good example where higher speed rail is actually preferable and easier to build than high speed rail, because you can use existing trackage. You can start to build that out. And I want to bring in Jay's comment too, that a lot of the rails to trails projects have kind of closed the door on the ability to like revert a lot of these spaces back to passenger service. And Chuck makes the point in his transportation talk. If you have a rails to trails program, you have to build in protections that say this can always be converted back. And guess what? To all the neighbors that are so happy that that dirty train isn't going by anymore, they actually probably will not be too bothered by passenger rail. Well, they're bothered by everything, but um, there's an opportunity to actually like say you should never like block it off at one key junction with a new school building or things like that. We will sometimes use that and be like, well, it's available land. Can you talk a little bit about like higher speed rail as maybe our core part of our ambition rather than the resource heavy requirements of high speed rail?
Yeah, in fact, well, one thing that popped in my mind was way back when I was finishing my bachelor's degree, and I had one of my professors ask me what my interest was going forward, and I said, yeah, really interested in transit and especially rail development. And he said, right of way. Remember the term right of way because that is like the most important thing to developing those services. And so it it's good that we have the Rails to Trails program, but we also need to be able to have that as Rails and Trails,
Yeah.
where I think that a lot of these corridors we could they're wide enough that we can squeeze a trail and a train on the same corridor and make it work together. But yeah, I think that there's a massive argument, especially for corridor preservation, that we don't want
Mhm.
to lose any of these linear corridors.
Mhm. Jay's asked a related question. Why don't we use more highway interstate right of way to build train tracks?
Part of it, well, um, it's kind of a general theme on strong towns that there are often issues with state DOTs.
Yeah.
So part of it is that it can often be very difficult to get state DOTs to share their rights of way. The other issue, and it's one that, well, in more mountainous areas, often the highway corridors are much steeper than what you can actually build a train line on. So
And
that's the other,
sharper
yeah, and
curves
you've
as
got
well.
sharp
Yeah.
curves, you've got steep grades. Um, so it's not always feasible, but there are lots of examples where our highway corridors are really wide, so we should be able to squeeze
Mhm.
trains into those corridors.
Yeah. I have a question. So a little personal privilege. Postal and parcel mail used to be boosted by, but then also helped fund passenger rail service. That's been dropped. We now have trucks that just do everything, or trucks and planes. Is there a way to restore that function, especially as a way of like boosting? I don't know if you need to subsidize it for a while along dedicated corridors, or is that ship or that train sailed?
That is something that I would really like to see studied and looked at because I think that it is feasible. I think sometimes our postal service is too focused on just doing everything itself and not looking at opportunities. But it's interesting because if you look at places in Europe, especially in Switzerland, uh, a lot of well, you can basically get anywhere in Switzerland using public transit. And a lot of that is through a service called the Post Bus,
Mm,
which combines bringing mail from the larger community into the post office
yeah.
of a smaller community using buses that are also, they're carrying mail and people on the same bus. So I think that that is something that we really need to look at in our overall delivery logistics system and just look at ways that we can make things more efficient. But in general, we need a whole lot more investment in the US in freight rail because unfortunately, all of our the class one railroads, the big railroad companies have optimize their operations to the point where they are actually turning down less profitable business in order to focus on the business that brings higher returns.
Mm,
And that means that more freight is having to be shipped on our highways.
yeah.
And if we actually had state DOTs that were examining freight movement more holistically, they would realize that it would make sense uh, to subsidize freight rail more in order to reduce how much we are subsidizing trucking.
Mhm.
Uh,
And I mean, if the trade-off of the freight rail system is that, it's the backbone of a lot of the movement of goods, Yet there's also a significant amount of like public subsidy, but also sort of the weight of law that helps these class one railroads in particular sort of keep up with current trends and maximize profitability for shareholders. But as a son of a farmer, I'm deeply distressed that like across Canada, they're abandoning all of the spur lines, they're abandoning all of the branch lines, and they're actually holding up most of the grain traffic because they've got oil that's coming through. And so if you have I mean, sorry, maybe this is, I'll, I'll close the point and then we'll probably have to go on to other things, is the idea of like, if it's a publicly controlled system, then there needs to be a considerable amount of public benefit. And when we begin to see that chipping away at it, I find it remarkable that the amount of mental dexterity that the CEOs of the class one railroads have to simultaneously demand continued protection by law, continued subsidy, and not have any interference in their business activities, even allowing, passenger rail to sort of suffer for it, is significant. But I digress because that is politics. You didn't all
Yeah.
show up for Norm's thoughts. But Aaron has a great question. We have an old freight line that is sometimes used for tourist purposes. How would we know if and when it would be good to start getting passenger service back onto the line? I really like this as a thought experiment of like, what does that look like? But also like, what would be some tactical steps to take to do that without massive capital expenditure? If anybody's here from British Columbia, we have the Island Rail from Victoria all the way up to Port Hardy. The rail already exists. And a really cool initiative is people are working together to buy stations, the old stations, and make sure that they are retained as property that can become stations again, rather than being converted into great museums or lovely second homes. What does that look like, and what guidance would you have for Aaron as he thinks through this?
Yeah, I would say like the first most important thing is to make sure that the corridor doesn't get abandoned. And it actually in the US is difficult for railroads to abandon corridors or and abandon like spur lines. They have to apply through the Surface Transportation Board to abandon that and basically show that there is no possibility in the future that there's ever going to be any both passenger and freight need on that corridor. So it's something that's actually difficult for them to do, but a lot of times they do end up just mothballing corridors. Uh, it is difficult to if it's one of the class one railroads, they are notoriously difficult to deal with. It's a little bit easier if it is a short line railroad that owns the corridor.
Mhm.
But one of the best ways to deal with it and try to preserve it for the future is to actually look for opportunities for a public entity to actually buy the corridor.
Mm.
And sometimes it's difficult because there isn't really an ideal entity within state and local government to take over uh, those corridors. So the states that are better at doing it actually have like a state rail division or rail commission. That's one of the issues that we have here in Utah is we don't really have an entity at the state level that can do that at this point. But if you can get it in the hands of an entity that will actually that sees it needing to function as a utility, uh, and whether that is providing like transit service or preservation as a heritage railway, that's usually the best way to do it.
And is that to prove some level of viability? I know that we have, an interurban train line that used to be the milk run. And so they would bring milk from the valley into the city and passengers were on it. It was electrified from the 1920s onwards, like just awesome infrastructure. And they're running a heritage route on it to try to say this could be a very simple investment for us. We've got a couple of choke points to deal with, but otherwise we'd be able to like move forward with that. Maybe a question that's related to that is like, what guidance would you offer if someone's a mayor or, everyone here plan to run for office tomorrow? What would you say that they would be able to, with credibility, propose as like a first increment or some of the early steps. Maybe in two categories: places that already have rail that want it to be just better, stations to be better, that sort of stuff, and then tied into that, those that say like we used to have service and we don't have it. What would our prospective candidates be advised to say?
I would really look at examples around the US and Canada where whether it is a like really small scale transit type rail service that's been put in or whether it's a heritage railway, but look at how the economic benefits and how that can be leveraged as basically a form of transit oriented development, which that was the whole reason why Brightline was developed in Florida. They basically had this short line railroad that happened to own this rail corridor that was perfectly positioned for real estate investments. And so they were able to leverage that. The hard part is that you have to realize that operating the passenger rail service likely is not going to actually turn a profit for whoever operates it. So you've got to build in some way of providing a subsidy to that service to
Hmm.
be able to unlock the real estate and economic benefits.
Yeah. Maybe I'll throw this over to Edward as well, and then we'll take up Al's question from Allentown. But Edward, do you want to jump in? How would you advise all of our prospective candidates for their campaign lunch tomorrow?
As Micah shared, this is a really, really complicated thing to get into. Because if you could get the so you have to think about this. You have to get the right of way. So you have to get the place you're going to put the trains. Then you have to get the funding to operate the trains. And then you have to actually buy the trains. And like our passenger rail trains, some of them are operating from the 60s. We just
Yeah.
continue to keep them on there. Um, so definitely communicate what these things are. And I know I'm in a region that there's battles every year on what commuter rail. Um, so it is a very complex issue.
Mhm. Well, and I think might have used the phrase like sabotage through capital funding. That like some of the challenges is that because operations is so tight and the operations budget is like you need to basically just you don't do the maintenance. And then the sabotage comes in the form of, hey, you get a train, you get a train, you get a train, you get a train. And some of those trains don't work with the existing systems. And so then you've got to like double down on extra systems to keep it all maintained. Meanwhile, all of the stuff that you weren't maintaining is still not being maintained, but the new stuff is now starting to age rapidly and starting to dive into a state of further decline. Appreciate that. What about this is a very practical question for everybody that is going to wake up tomorrow and be a resident of your community. So maybe you've sidelined your campaign launch. Is it common, maybe Mike especially, to face a version of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, when discussing train network expansions? And are there sort of panaceas or things that help with this? What are, I think you touched on the socioeconomic benefits and people's eyes start to glaze over of like, well, that's, money talk or that's other people talk. What about for individuals? Have you found some paths to help people really connect with these issues and realize the benefit for them?
Well, the ideal thing would be to take them on a train and show them examples of how things actually work. But that's, difficult to get everybody out there. But we definitely see a lot of issues. In fact, there's a really good example of a NIMBY issue that's going on right here in the Salt Lake Valley, where along our existing commuter rail line, there is it's beyond a proposal. It's basically they're going to be adding an infill station because there is a large area that used to be where our state prison was that is now going to be redeveloped. Uh, that is on the east side of where the train already runs, but immediately to the west side is an existing single family neighborhood. And the residents there are very much up in arms that even though the trains are already going by, they don't want trains stopping there because they are concerned that it's going to bring crime to their neighborhood and reduce their property values. And so they've kind of like realized that the station's going to be built, but they don't want any pedestrian access to their neighborhood. And it is something that everybody is anticipating, everybody that like understands things a little better, that they're going to build this station without that access. And pretty quickly, they're going to have people walking back what they've said in the past, and they're actually going to want access. In fact, we saw this in a bus rapid transit line that was built about 10 years ago in Utah, where neighbors in one neighborhood didn't want to stop put in their neighborhood. And almost immediately after it opened, they did a 180. And next month, we're actually opening that infill station along the bus rapid transit line. So, what I've been saying that they ideally should do is basically build the access, but fence it off for the time being. And then when people in their neighborhood like realize that it actually would be a benefit for them to just be able to walk from where they live to the station, then they can just take the fences down and open it up.
Yeah.
But it's something where yeah, it's well, and I think one of the best examples is if the people actually look at the stop immediately to the south, it kind of has similar conditions. And if you talk to the people that live in the neighborhood that is served by the pedestrian access that fortunately was added to that station, I think that the people in the neighborhood would say that they'd really like just being able to walk over and hop on the train.
And it makes a huge difference what you get dumped down to in as well. So can't remember which of the two cities has done it better, but Albuquerque and Santa Fe, I've heard if you take, is it the Roadrunner is the route that runs up like back
Yeah.
and forth. And like one of them, you're just dumped into a parking lot. The other, you're dumped into a place. And if we pick up Andrew Price's language of like, there's places and then non-places. And the opposite of a place is not like a desert. It's just like a space that people have simply said like has no value, has no meaning within its context. We're coming up on the top of the hour here. I'm really grateful for the time that we've had on this because we've definitely covered a ton of ground. And I wanted to highlight, I've got some new tools, so I'm so excited to share them. Our top commentators, Brian, well done. And then Kelly in a solid second place, actually tied for second place, tied for first. And then we've got Jay as well. Holding it down, Aaron, Francis, Carrie, Jean, Chesla. So thank you all for participating with that, with some great questions along the way as well. That's awesome. Like I said, if there's anything else that we can do, if this was a popular topic, and I love, we had a good number of participants to get today. Let's take it up again. Mike, I probably will be asking for a reprise. We'll look at other opportunities as well. This is, we're going up until mid-December for Ask Strong Towns Anything. So if you have questions, we got to some of the ones that were submitted. We will do our best to try to get to more of them as we go. But I always want to prioritize. If you're here in person, we're going to take up your question. And so I hope we got to quite a number of them. And the recording of this will be on YouTube. So that'll get posted to the Strong Towns Library pretty soon here. We just posted the one from the podcast one. It usually takes me almost between 3 days to a week to get them up, depending on the other work that I've got going on. But love to do this. Love to connect. Thanks again, Mike, and to the whole crew. Tons of great stuff. I will do my best also to share the chat in a resource page that we connect to this, because we've had a lot of good conversation there. So well done. Have a great rest of the day. To the lucky few of you, ride the train and wish us well. For the rest of us, we'll conspire. We'll start our campaigns tomorrow, or we'll take note of what the opportunities look like going ahead. And actually, if we want, we'll go to down zone and we'll chat about US code 24308C because I have questions. And so thanks for watching this version of Ask Strong Down Zone.